Alrighty, well, hi everyone, and welcome to Collegeville Connections, our series of online events presented by the Collegeville Institute in central Minnesota. Our goal for this series is to highlight the really good work being done by so many of our Collegeville Institute alumni and friends. My name is Jessie Bazan. I'm the program associate for the Collegeville Institute seminars, and I'll be serving as our moderator today. Before we dive into the content, just a few logistical notes. So we have people viewing this webinar both on Zoom and on the Collegeville Institute's Facebook Live. There will be points throughout the presentation where our presenter will invite people to offer feedback in the chat box. If you have a specific question for Claire, we'd ask that you put that in the Q&A box, and we'll have time for questions at the end. If you're participating on Facebook, please write your comments or questions in the comments box, and one of our staff members will be sure to pass that along to me. And then if you have to duck out early or miss any points, know that a recording of today's presentation will be up on the Collegeville Institute YouTube page later today. Okay, on to the good stuff. I'm so pleased to introduce to you Dr. Claire Wolfteich, our presenter for today. Claire is professor of practical theology and spirituality studies at Boston University School of Theology, where she also co-directs the Center for Practical Theology. Now, in addition, Claire is the project director of the Creative Callings Innovation Hub, which is one of 13 hubs in the Called to Lives of Meaning and Purpose initiative, an initiative that's funded by the Lilly Endowment and coordinated by the Collegeville Institute seminars. One of our main goals of the Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose initiative is to equip Christians to discern and live out their callings, and to enhance the communal callings of congregations. Now, our 13 hubs do this in a whole host of wonderful ways, but I've always been particularly intrigued by Claire's vision for the BU hub. She grounds her work with congregation in the spiritual practices of Sabbath. Claire seems to be swimming in Sabbath. She teaches graduate courses on Sabbath. She's written a book called Sabbath in the City. And as the world continues to speed up, Claire and her team invite congregations into intentional rest, renewal, and discernment so that they can be in a good position to listen deeply to the Spirit's promptings. We're thrilled to have Claire here with us today to share some of her insights on Sabbath with you. Claire, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you here with Collegeville Institute. Again, this is a webinar on a call to Sabbath, and I hope that you will experience this time as a mini invitation to Sabbath and a chance for just some good reflection on what Sabbath might mean in your life and in the life of your communities. As Jessie mentioned, I have really been thinking about Sabbath for a while and do teach a course called Sabbath Theology and Practice. And my current thinking about Sabbath is also deeply informed by my work with congregations in creative callings. And so you'll hear as we go some of the congregation's own experience coming through maybe, and some reflection questions that are also prompted by my work with creative callings. I should say too that as a practical theologian, I'm really interested in thinking about what Sabbath means contextually and what it might mean in the particularities of different communities and situations and contexts. So I really invite you as we go to kind of bring your own situation into the room and just kind of open yourself to what this might mean and what insights or questions you might want to contribute during this time. So a call to Sabbath, as I have put together the idea of calling and the idea of Sabbath, I'm more and more intrigued by the question of, do we actually have a call to Sabbath? Or another way of thinking about it, is there something in the theology and practice of Sabbath keeping that sheds light on what a calling actually means? To be kind of put a critical edge on it too, is there something about Sabbath theology and practice that actually serves as a corrective to distorted understandings of vocation that overemphasize productivity, achievement, and action. And when I say distorted, I mean the kind of sea that we all swim in, right? It's not like a personal fault. It's more a question of we're embedded in culture, including religious culture, that really pushes production. And so I'm intrigued by the invitation that Sabbath offers us to reimagine calling and to live into it with a Sabbath kind of a Sabbath mentality, a Sabbath dimension to our experience. And so as I think about calling and Sabbath, there are a few different calls that I want to identify. And the first one is the call to embrace the gift of creation. So I'd like you to maybe look outside a window if you're near a window, or look around you if you have plants in your room, and just call to mind, maybe you have a pet there. Just take a moment to kind of connect to creation around you. I think this is really core to Sabbath. Sabbath is, I think one way that I like to think of it is in the way that Pope John Paul II describes it in his work Dies Domini, which is the Day of the Lord, in which he talks about the seventh day as a day in which God lingers in a gazing at the creation with delight. And I just think that's a beautiful image of Sabbath as contemplation, Sabbath as a chance to restore our connectedness to the natural world, to God, and to one another. I think another important part of the call to Sabbath is the call to receive the holiness of time. Okay, the call to receive the holiness of time. Time feels often like it's really compressed. And again, might just ask you to think about, what has your experience of time been, say in the last week? And just take a moment, maybe you want to add something to the chat, a couple words. What has your experience of time been? Okay, some people might experience time as rushed, compacted. In my own work, I've done a lot of thinking about time poverty, this idea that we're just poor on time. I see in the chat people saying they never have enough of time, right? Time has felt quick. In writing on Sabbath, there's a different sort of sense of time, okay? I see time feeling like a commodity as another experience. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's one, you'll hear his name a lot today. He's written the book, the classic book, The Sabbath, and it's a very poetic, beautiful book on the Sabbath. He talks about the holiness of time and how in Judaism, which of course, holds so much wisdom about Sabbath. Sabbath reflects the holiness of time. It's a foretaste of eternity. Heschel writes about time as God's song. I just think that's a beautiful image, time as God's song, and even the Sabbath as a taste of eternity. So we have so far, as we think about Sabbath, that Sabbath is reflecting a call to embrace creation and to embrace the holiness of time. And so I'd like to offer a kind of meditation. We'll have a few different meditations during this time together. And I'd like to offer a meditation in a poem by Nicholas Lee, and it's called Sabbatical. And I think you'll see both this sense of slowing down time, pausing, lingering, gazing, and enjoying the gift of being, the gift of created being that we have. So Sabbatical by Nicholas Lee. I'll read it, but I invite you, if you'd like, to read it yourself as well. Live like the rain. taking its time, in no hurry to stop, drenching the thirsty ground, simple and serious. Taking the goodness deep within, giving back beauty and green. Live like the cat, stretched out under the rose bush, giving herself to sleep in the delicious morning. Live like you believe in your life, even love it, like it's the kind of gift you say it is, and not any kind of punishment. As you go backwards and forwards, up and down the garden path, living the life you are called to love. And again, we see their call to love. So that's part of Sabbath, call to love the gift of life. Is there a word from the poem that stays with you, a word to hold on to? And I'm thinking here also of, Lectio Divina and the possibility of holding onto a life-giving word, a word that would be something to linger with. Okay, I invite you to share that in the chat. Is there a word from the poem? I see garden, live, as we think about Sabbath and what Sabbath might offer us in terms of really thinking about vocation, part of the calling of Sabbath is a call to dignified work. So every theology of Sabbath carries in it a kind of theology of work. What makes work good? What makes work have dignity? Of course, in teaching on theologies of work, part of the human calling is to work, and that work has to reflect the dignity of the human person. So it cannot be unceasing, right? Unceasing work is akin to slavery. It can't be work that crushes the soul, that oppresses or is unhealthful. Okay, so if we think about what is good work, we see some of the social justice implications of a call to Sabbath, that it's not just a kind of self-help care for me, but it is really a call to create conditions of work for everyone and to resist structures that oppress. Heschel writes that labor without dignity is a cause of misery, and that Sabbath is an appreciation, not a depreciation of labor. So I'd like you to think about work and what work is like for you right now and what work might be like in the communities, your own faith communities. And think about where's the dignity in that work? How does work contribute to the common good? How does it humanize us? How does it help people to develop their gifts? How has work shifted in this time of COVID? How does racial injustice impact the dignity of work? All of those kinds of questions. And I'm going to play a video sort of meditation that will probably evoke the kind of busyness that's part, again, of that sea that we're all swimming in as we think about the different spheres of labor that we're in. And some of that is paid labor and some of it is unpaid labor. So I'm including here a big umbrella when I think about work. I'm thinking about volunteer work. I'm thinking about the labor within our churches. I'm thinking about labor within the home. Okay, who does work so that others may rest, right? All of those are kinds of questions that we can talk about. So this video that's coming up here is going to show you lots of images of work and a kind of busyness. And then it's going to contrast with a quote from John Paul II's Dies Domini, the quote that I had alluded to earlier, that shows kind of God lingering over the goodness of creation, that kind of contemplative, delighted gaze. And I see there a call to delight as part of the call to Sabbath.
The divine rest of the seventh day does not allude to an inactive God, but emphasizes the fullness of what has been accomplished. It speaks, as it were, of God's lingering before the very good work which his hand has wrought, in order to cast upon it a gaze full of joyous delight. This is a contemplative gaze, which does not look to new accomplishments, but enjoys the beauty of what has already been achieved.
So we see there, again, the question about what is dignified work? How do we create opportunities for that dignity of work? How do we resist unjust structures of work? And we see there the beauty of really work in creation as well, and the invitation to pause long enough to delight in that. So part of Sabbath, the call to Sabbath, is a call to rest, for sure. That's often how people think of Sabbath. But it's also a call to liberation. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about rest and liberation. Heschel talks about resting as if your work were done. And I love that phrase, as if your work were done. So again, if we think of a Jewish context and the arrival of Shabbat on a Friday evening, there's a flurry of activity often in preparation and labor that creates the conditions for the celebration of Shabbat, the observance of Shabbat that begins at sundown. And when that time comes, different Jewish communities celebrate Sabbath differently, obviously, but your tasks may not be finished, but you rest as if they were. And so I think there is something really important in there. And he also has a very interesting phrase that we should rest even in striving for God. Okay, one must abstain from toil and strain on the seventh day, even from strain in the service of God. And I do a lot of work with religious leaders, with ministry students, and with doctor of ministry students. And this is always a phrase that really stands out to people. And I, again, invite you to put your questions or your comments in the Q&A so that we can get to those at the end here. But really, as you think about it, where is Sabbath in the lives of religious leaders? I know in working with our congregations in creative callings, this has been a key issue, and certainly with COVID, living with COVID in the last number of years, it's really been an important issue. For example, one of our leaders described this time as a season of toxic stress. Okay, the last several years as a season of toxic stress, and said all of our creative and healing energy went into reimagining every aspect of our daily and liturgical lives. And so if you can imagine, you know, the shift and the pivoting and the development of online resources and the effort to recalibrate one's calling, in a sense, in the face of these urgent needs. It certainly put a lot of pressure on religious leaders. And so part of what I think we could talk about is, again, from a practical theological standpoint, how do you embody this call that Heschel is naming here? To abstain from toil and strain on the seventh day, even from strain in the service of God. For many religious leaders that I've worked with, it's the fact that they are in a calling that makes it difficult to rest. It makes it difficult to take Sabbath because their calling is so compelling. So again, I'm asking for, is there a way that we can rethink calling such that it incorporates and even witnesses to this freer, more liberated sense of relationship, service, and witness? In working with some pastors a few years ago, we asked them to take a sabbatical as part of their work with us, their program with us. And one of them, I'll never forget this, said that in taking a sabbatical, actually from ministry for several weeks, he recalled his truest, most fundamental calling. And that calling had kind of gotten dampened down by the busyness of the church and the business of the church. Okay, so there's a lot to talk about here about rest and rest in the lives of religious leaders and faith communities as well. I've been interested too in this question, again, bringing my practical theology hat on, looking at gender, looking at mothering, looking at caretaking. Obviously, if you have small children or children with special needs, their needs don't stop. So how does one create space for Sabbath, or does Sabbath look differently? Does rest look differently, given the different callings on us and multiple and sometimes conflicting callings on us? So would love to talk a little bit more about rest and what that looks like in your particular circumstances. Liberation, this is a beautiful phrase from Heschel. He talks about the seventh day as the exodus from tension, the liberation of man from his own muddiness. And we can make that gender inclusive, the liberation of the human person from their own muddiness. If you know the work of Walter Brueggemann, he has a more contemporary work on Sabbath called Sabbath as Resistance, saying no to the culture of now. And Brueggemann talks about two words, resistance and alternative, that Sabbath is a countercultural resistance to a culture of productivity and immediacy, but it's also a beautiful alternative, and an alternative that can involve some struggle and change. Okay, so Sabbath can be transformative. It's rest that, yes, it's personal, but it's also communal, and it's also often countercultural. So I'd like to share this quote from another writer on Sabbath that gets at these themes as well. This is from Dorothy Bass, who's written a whole book on Sabbath as well. This is from a shorter piece, and she writes this: Christians who keep holy a weekly day of rest and worship acquire through the Christian practice of Sabbath keeping an embodied knowledge that the world does not depend on our own capacity for ceaseless work. I love that phrase, embodied knowledge. Okay, I think that's something to keep in mind as well. She writes, keeping Sabbath, Christian practitioners come to know in their bones, that's the embodiment, to know in their bones that creation is God's gift, that God does not intend that anyone should work without respite, and that God has conquered death in the resurrection of Christ. So a couple things to notice here, and again, you may want to add your own reflections in the Q&A. Bass is really talking about practice as yielding embodied knowledge. Okay, and so the question is, how do we actually come to know something? How do we come to know something about Sabbath, about calling? She's saying we know it by doing it over time in a community of practice. And I definitely think this is very true. Part of my classes entail this integration of theory and theology and practice. And we usually invite students to cultivate a Sabbath practice. And we attend a Shabbat service and we reflect with the community, because we do know something differently when we actually, for example, turn off our devices for a period of time, or go out for a contemplative walk, or light candles, or sing. We know something in an embodied way. So part of, I think, the call to Sabbath is to know something of God and who we're created to be, which is at root the grounding of our calling, to know that in our bodies, right? So there are lots of things that we know in our bodies. We are formed as bodily people, as incarnate people. And so that is a question I just put out there in terms of what have you actually come to know through your practice? Okay. And then I'd like, again, we are sort of moving into Christian theologies of Sabbath keeping, which for most Christian writers depends on understanding of Jewish theology or understanding and practice, right? People like John Paul II have said we cannot rediscover the meaning of Sunday unless we go back and learn the ancient wisdom of Sabbath from our Jewish brothers and sisters. And I find this very compelling. And part of the study of Sabbath is parsing out sort of how to understand it from a tradition perspective. And how do Christian understandings draw from Judaism while also not sort of co-opting Jewish practice without real dialogue and distinction. So I want to put out there this important verse from the Christian scriptures, Matthew 11:28-30. As we think about calling and Sabbath, I think this scripture is really key and very beautiful. It's a call to relationship. It's a call to rest in Christ. Okay, the idea that true rest is a kind of deep rest that Christ offers, and that in drawing close to Christ, we receive this. So this verse, this is going to be another kind of meditation that I hope you'll enjoy, and it's from the Message translation of the Bible. So from the Message Bible. Here we go.
Are you tired, worn out, burnt out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unenforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly.
And so as we absorb that passage, and I invite you to, if you are from a tradition that is not Judaism or Christianity, to think about what Sabbath might mean, or whether there are parallels to Sabbath in your own tradition. What scriptures would you go to as source of renewal to convey this idea, or to think about calling in this way? And so some questions as we kind of near the end of our presentation time. Or what is the call to Sabbath in your life and in your own community or communities? The kind of critical liberative question of who has access to Sabbath. And this is something, again, that Creative Callings has really thought about with our congregations, thinking about racial justice, thinking about gender, thinking about economics and the patterns of work and how work has evolved under COVID in the last number of years. Who is an essential worker? Who is doing the labor of the church right now? Some of our pastors have posed the question of how can they make Sabbath more accessible to their own staff? Okay. We might ask whether students experience Sabbath and how are they formed for ministry if they don't? Okay, who has access to Sabbath? And then what are obstacles to Sabbath in your own context? Okay, so we often have a call and we have impediments to that call. We have discernment. We have the reality, the contextual reality of how to embody a call. And it's an ever evolving process. So I invite you into that practical theological work of thinking about call and Sabbath and where that is in the particularities of your own life, and to sort of draw your own community into that question as well. I wanted to share this beautiful verse from Isaiah. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. And as a kind of closing meditation here before we go to the Q&A, I'm going to share a Wendell Berry poem. And I invite you to either read it yourself or just sit with it for a few moments. I hope you've enjoyed that. Really looking forward to our conversation. And yes, I invite you to put any questions or insights, anything from your own work into the Q&A. And I see some comments in the chat that I'd love to read out as we continue here. Sabbath and justice are deeply connected, from Carla. From Bob. For clergy, Sabbath needs to happen on a different day. Yes, definitely a lot of religious leaders that I'm working with, including in Creative Callings, kind of are thinking about that and the question of whether Sabbath should be on a Monday or whether Sabbath really can be on Sunday. Can you lead worship and experience that time as prayer and praise and worship for yourself? I see too, how about honoring sabbatical space for clergy households? Great question. These are all in the chat. There may be more in the Q&A. I'm also going to stop screen share too, so maybe we'll come back here. What are some practical ways organizational leaders can help foster Sabbath for their staff and colleagues? Someone writes, for sure, as much as Sabbath requires obedience, a great amount of creativity is needed at various points in one's life. Yeah, that's a really insightful comment, that Sabbath is understood as a as a command, if you look at the Hebrew Bible scriptures, but also an invitation, right? And there's a kind of creative adaptation. I think that's actually one of the contested points in both Judaism and Christianity is how exactly Sabbath practice should be enacted and how much flexibility is there for creativity. What's the balance between law and freedom in Sabbath practice, right? What are the ways in which the community provides kind of structure and support for Sabbath practice? That's something as I have explored Sabbath in Judaism, that's something that I've kind of longed for, that I think many Christians in feeling this call to Sabbath do not necessarily have the kind of communal support that some Jewish communities have as well. So Jesse, I might pass to you and see if there are other questions that you'd like to name, and then we can get into some of these good topics.
Wonderful. Well, first, Claire, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation and inviting us into the reflection, poetry, and thinking theologically about Sabbath. That was really, really rich. And it complemented so nicely. I was thinking the most recent Collegeville Connections that we had back in early February with Jonathan Malesic, who spoke about his new book, The End of Burnout, which is getting a good amount of publicity these days. So I was wondering, Claire, if you could offer any particular practices of Sabbath that might help people overcome the burnout culture that's so prevalent today.
Well, that's a great question. I've actually been really interested in burnout recently, also in kind of looking at some of the literature on that, and I'll be interested to look at the book that you've just mentioned, because if you look at what's happening with work and these phrases of the great resignation or the great disengagement, there is a lot of burnout. There's some questions about whether burnout is exactly the right phrase or whether it's a kind of movement to something else. So I think that's worth thinking about. I think just regular practices of renewal are very important. I think turning off the computer, actually in my doctor of ministry class, one of our students just did a whole poem called Turn Off the Computer. and I think that actually is a very helpful practice. It's very hard to do, but the constant multitasking, going to different windows on computer, the constant responsiveness to email, I do think it creates a kind of brain drain that's sort of in the background, and spirit drain that can be hard to counter. And I'm definitely not here as expert. I really see myself as facilitating reflection and conversation about these topics. We all are in the same, cultural sea. For myself, getting out in nature is extremely important. Walking, kind of rhythmic practice. But even a small, like it's absolutely freezing here in Boston today, but just a small time outside, with my dog, just seeing the snow, seeing the trees, I find that very, very renewing. Music, and also really setting boundaries around work. So, for example, I attempt not to write emails to people over the weekend, not to students for sure. Sometimes we need to do that, but trying to set aside the time, aware that there's an interconnectedness of work. So when someone emails someone else, that lands in their inbox and can, pressure a reaction or response. So trying to set some boundaries around work, I think those are very important. It's been challenging not being able to worship in person with a faith community at points, certain large segments of time over the last number of years with COVID. And I do think that communal worship is really vital for many of us in preventing burnout. But I will say it is something that our congregations have written a lot about and when we did interviews with them recently, they've really spoken about the challenge of not having embodied presence. and how important that is to renewal and to sustaining the work. So I like the sort of, I like the accessibility that technology provides, but also finding ways to step away from it, even at this time of COVID, I think has been really important. So people, laughter, nature, movement. We do a lot of sitting. I think that can really promote burnout as well. And for me, I think seeing calling in a large way, not reducing it to any particular task, can be very, very helpful. That there is a much larger calling and a creativity in that calling that's beyond, you know, the next thing that has to be done. So those are a few reflections back.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I wrote down in big letters as you were talking that embodied knowledge, that concept, and just how crucial that is to our Sabbath practices and to our well-being.
Yeah.
We have a question here that I think you'll have lots of insights for. Bob asks, he says, almost all of your images of Sabbath are images from nature. What about folks that live in cities? And I should say here, I've got a copy of Claire's book, which is called Sabbath in the City, Sustaining Urban Pastoral Excellence. So Claire, what are your thoughts on practicing Sabbath in cities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It is one that we pondered a lot in this project, which was called Sustaining Urban Pastoral Excellence. And it resulted in the book that Jesse was holding up, Sabbath in the City. In that project, we worked with pastors, about 100 pastors across the US, around the question of sort of what is urban pastoral excellence and what sustains it. And in that work, we came more and more to Sabbath as being really critical to sustaining pastors in the city and to sustaining their congregations. There is a lot in nature, I think, that is vital as we think about the call to Sabbath. And part of it is restoring connectivity with a wider ecology and the wider created world. That can certainly happen in the city. And many of our pastors talked about, you know, just finding green space in the city, or looking at buildings and thinking about, you know, the construction of buildings, the architecture, the beauty and form, looking at communities and the different, the variety of human communities that exist in the city, the vibrancy of that. So I think nature is not something that does not exist in a city, but you're absolutely right that Sabbath is very much also about the human community and who is the human and what is work. Here's an image. So I teach at Boston University, so I teach in a city, and I have brought students to Hillel for Shabbat services. And at our Hillel, the building borders, actually the Orthodox chapel within the building looks out on the Charles River, which traverses right next to Storrow Drive, which is a major thoroughfare. So it's just lovely. This might be an image of Sabbath in the City. You can look out the windows, and as the chanting of the service is happening and the lights are dimming in the sky, you see both, you know, this peacefulness descend on the city, and you see all the lights of the traffic at 6 p.m. on a Friday night right there. So I think that Sabbath is in the midst, right? It's something that is in the midst of the busyness. And it's been very helpful to me to kind of hold on to that as well, and hold on to the sense of, you know, you're not resting only because you're in this idyllic situation or everything's done, but you are resting in the midst, and that work will be there when you pick it up again. So that's some response, but I certainly welcome other people to add comments to that. I will say that for our, just one other comment, for our urban pastors, Sabbath was very important in part because of the depth of human need that they encountered so constantly. And one of our groups of pastors called themselves midwives of Sabbath. to people in trauma. And that was a phrase that really struck me, this image of being a midwife of Sabbath to people in trauma. And they did talk about burnout and how easy it was to be burned out in the ministry of caring ceaselessly. And many religious leaders feel that, I think. So that sense of being a midwife to Sabbath and pausing long enough to recall that call to Sabbath in the midst. I think that's been pretty important to our leaders.
That's a beautiful image, being a midwife to Sabbath.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I've appreciated, Claire, how throughout this conversation, you've offered ways people as individuals can engage in Sabbath. But that image of being a midwife to Sabbath speaks to this, how do we create this larger culture where Sabbath practice is accepted?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leads to a question that our new executive director, Jacqueline Bussey, asked. What are some practical ways that organizational leaders can help foster Sabbath for their staff and colleagues?
That's a great question, and I would love to see more written on that as well. So I sort of just extend that invitation back for organizational leaders to be asking that question. I mean, here is where I think that theologies of work are vital as well, and that part of what you're offering is, again, dignified work. So it's again, putting boundaries around email is one way. I think that for some organizations, having flexibility about remote work can be really a gift of time to employees, such that you're not adding commuting time, or you're making it more possible to care for children, to take care of errands and such, that that commuting time, would eat up, or simply to organize one's work in ways that fit with one's particular context. So I think that can be a gift. Sometimes organizations will hold sort of mandatory retreats. And this is something I have some thoughts about this, that sometimes holding an extra retreat on a Saturday, for example, it's not a Sabbath. It can be sort of an additional work burden. And so sort of being very attuned to the balance of vocational spheres of workers, I think is really important, and time and how time is experienced by workers. I will say sort of one parallel question that we've been thinking about for a long time here in the School of Theology at BU is really that question of formation, and how do we, as you said, form a culture of Sabbath keeping. It's very, very challenging. And I feel this with, every time I teach a course on Sabbath, I'm aware that I'm simultaneously assigning work and trying to create space for Sabbath practice. And sometimes that dissonance is really jarring, so I guess really thinking through what we're doing as organizations, the sort of explicit talk and implicit formation that's happening. Sometimes those are not the same. So I think maybe inviting workers into that conversation, particularly in communities where Sabbath is not necessarily defined strictly as sort of a day set apart, and people have this creative project of adapting and finding spaces of Sabbath and practices of Sabbath, inviting them into the conversation of where that fits within the current organizational culture. I think that would be a wonderful first step, to have a process that is safe, that feels safe, where people can actually offer input, and think about what is the place of the organization in that. Definitely, I think I would add one other thought, which is just space for embodiment in the workday. Whether it's again, I'm not a big fan of mandatory practice in organizations. So maybe not a mandatory yoga session, but we're going to end early today so that you can have that gift of time and decide how that's best used. Or, we're in place of this meeting, we're going to have a half an hour contemplative walk, if you like. I always like that sense of freedom, because I do think that freedom is important to practice, to spiritual practice. So.
Thanks, Claire.
Great topic, and there's so much more that could be said. Yeah,
that's
together.
for sure. Yeah, I'm eager to see how we start to implement that at the Collegeville Institute, and how others organizations can really start to embed that in their practices. This may be a time to make a little plug. So my colleague Jane Patterson developed this wonderful retreat on Sabbath as a vocational practice, which I'll link to in the chat in a minute. We designed this for congregational leaders to take that time to reflect on Sabbath. But I think that it too could be useful. Some of the reflection questions and prompts could be helpful for any organization that maybe would want to use that as a starting point for talking about how they could incorporate Sabbath as individuals and as their community. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes for questions. We've got one here from Sister Maria, who says that Rabbi Abraham Heschel wrote that to sanctify is also the Hebrew word for marriage, as in God sanctified the seventh day, or the Sabbath. She's wondering if you, Claire, could elaborate on this. And it looks like she's thinking particularly about going to Mass on Sundays as a Catholic Christian, or attending other worship, how that connects in with this call to practice Sabbath.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm thinking of the Shabbat service, and a particular moment in the service where the congregation turns to the door to welcome the Sabbath bride. And Heschel does use this nuptial language, nuptial imagery for Sabbath, that it is it is very gendered, but it is, it is the dear one, it's the beloved. And I think that's a lovely image to think about Sabbath as the beloved, to think about Sunday as a time, and again, I would be careful about sort of just quickly laying something from one tradition into another. I do refer to that John Paul II text, Dies Domini, the Day of the Lord, as a really, really developed understanding of Sunday and the place, for example, of the Mass. What's the relationship of Sabbath to Sunday? That's a really big, complex theological question. But certainly the Mass as a place of drawing close. If you think about the call to come unto me, the Eucharist is that call, right, to that kind of union and closeness, and so I think that sense of love and friendship and union is a really beautiful image when we think about Sabbath. And it's sort of it kind of works against maybe an older, sort of more Puritan, rule-oriented understanding of Sabbath as, what one cannot do. And I think in the large amount of writing that's coming out about Sabbath from Christian writers today, there really is much more of a sense of Sabbath as life-giving, Sabbath as a space of humanization, Sabbath as a practice that's deeply embedded in the tradition, and one that really could be understood with this marriage imagery of a sense of time when one can unite with the beloved. And if you see prayer in that light, Teresa of Avila, prayer is an intimate sharing between friends, then certainly one can think about Sabbath in that way.
Excellent. Well, I've got maybe one more question for you, Claire, and then we'll wrap up for today. So as Jane and I were developing this Sabbath retreat, you sent us a wonderful and lengthy list of resources on Sabbath. And I'm wondering if you could condense that down into your top 2 resources for our audience, maybe one for people who are brand new or relatively new to practicing Sabbath, And then a second one for folks who are currently practicing Sabbath and want to go deeper into their practice. What are two resources that you'd recommend?
Well, you're limiting me to two. That's very challenging. I would have to put Heschel, the Sabbath, as in my top two for sure. It's a very poetic, kind of mystical approach to Sabbath. It came out in the early 1950s, was addressed to kind of the American Jewish community, really kind of drawing them to sort of back to the just the core of Jewish holiness in Heschel's view. So I see that as really a wonderful work. There are many Christian writings on Sabbath recently, so it is difficult. Nicholas Lee has a new book on Sabbath. Walter Brueggemann's book, Sabbath as Resistance, has been very influential for a number of our students. I might put that in among my top works. Dorothy Bass's writing is beautiful. I will say that I find poetry to be a very evocative way into Sabbath, partly because my work does deal with words so much, and so I am drawn to some different ways of expression. And so Wendell Berry's book of sabbatical poems is also a lovely way into the topic. So I've transgressed the question there by offering more than two, but those are some good resources.
Oh, that's wonderful. No, this is great, Claire. You've given us such a rich insights and thoughtfulness to keep pondering for our own practices of Sabbath and for practicing Sabbath within our communities, whatever that looks like. We so appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness today. Thanks so much.
Thanks for the invitation. It's been great to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we'd invite everyone to come back for more Collegeville Connections. We've got a few more yet this spring. Our next Collegeville Connection will be on Ash Wednesday, March 2nd. We'll have Carol Younger of Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, New York, one of the churches in the Communities of Calling initiative. We'll be talking on praying with our pens, leading us through some spiritual writing practices on Ash Wednesday. So we hope to see you back then. And again, thanks so much to all of you for your time today, and Claire for your insights. Take care.